Imagine a man who had it all: power, money, talent, beauty, and an unprecedented mind. She changed the world, created empires, captivated Hollywood and aviation. But gradually this genius became a prisoner of his own fears and obsessions. And although it seemed that Hughes had control over everything, in fact he lost control of himself. And at the end of this story you will learn the incredible truth about who he really was. Hughes was born into a world where wealth was not just a convenience, but an absolute power over reality. His father had an oil empire that brought the family money and status, and his mother was strict and demanding, which from an early age formed in him a wild desire to control everything around him. Already at the age of 5 or 6, Hughes showed an unusual interest in machines, mechanisms, and airplanes. He would disassemble and assemble toys, watching how the small parts moved, and often left them scattered on a table, then spend hours watching how everything worked together. This was no ordinary childish interest. On the contrary, he displayed a perfectionism that would not give anyone peace. If a bolt did not fit perfectly in its place, he could spend hours trying different ways until he achieved impeccable accuracy. Little rituals began to appear early. He demanded that his toys be in a certain order, that the room be absolutely clean, and even insisted that he always have his own table with the exact dimensions and position of all things. Adults often smiled or clutched their heads in surprise. They saw only the strange whims of the child, not realizing that these very little habits would become harbingers of his future obsession with order, control, and fear of chaos. His childhood was both charming and strange. He could spend hours watching an old engine work, dreaming of his own planes, and at the same time reacting to the slightest carelessness. If someone put a cup in the wrong place, Hughes felt an inner discomfort that no one could explain. His family often called it weirdness or childish whim, but it was the first of the disturbing notes that sprouted in his soul, small, almost imperceptible cracks that would eventually turn into something much deeper. And even then, in those early years, it was clear that Hughes was not just living in his own world, but in a world he was trying to adjust to his own logic, where everything had to obey his vision, and where even the smallest deviations from order became imperceptible alarm bells of his future obsession. This childhood laid the foundation for a man who would later build empires, fly airplanes the world had never seen before, and at the same time find himself trapped in his own mind, gradually moving away from reality, step by step. As Hughes grew older, his childhood fascination with mechanisms and aircraft grew into a real passion for business and technology. He didn't just inherit his father's fortune, he turned it into a huge empire. Oil, construction, investments, everything he took on turned into a successful project. But his successes always went hand in hand with invisible threads of obsession that held him tightly in their hands. Hughes could not afford to trust others. He controlled every little thing, checked the accounts, reviewed every counter. His colleagues quickly learned that working with Hughes was both exciting and exhausting. He could inspire a team to undertake grandiose projects and at the same time be irritated by the slightest mistake. His reputation was built on a combination of brilliance and strict exactingness. Success and control went hand in hand. But even when he achieved results, his obsession and perfectionism did not disappear. On the contrary, they deepened with each major project. These traits were evident even in small things. When checking building plans, he would change one angle by half a degree because he felt it was more correct, or he would drive engineers crazy by fixing something that from anyone else's point of view was flawless. Hints of future madness were already visible here. Even in his own success, Hughes began to lose his way, unable to find the line between reality and how it should be. But it was during this period that his empire laid the foundation for Hughes's legendary name. People admired his genius, his ability to predict trends, his ability to take risks where others feared. His obsession with control and perfectionism, which had once seemed strange, now seemed part of his unsurpassed skill. People saw only the result, not the tiny cracks that were beginning to grow in his psyche. And even as the empire grew, Hughes gradually began to feel the same inner tension that would later turn into obsession, fear, and loneliness. His first business successes brought him fame and fortune, but at the same time, they were the first steps into a world where control becomes an addiction and genius a trap. Aviation was always more than just a hobby for Hughes. It was his way of conquering the skies, just as he had conquered business and mechanics. He had been fascinated by airplanes as a child, but now his dreams had turned into large-scale real-world projects. He bought airlines, financed the construction of the latest aircraft, risked his own flights, setting speed records. To the world, it seemed like an incredible feat of courage. To Hughes, a way to prove to himself that he could control every aspect of the sky. His first record-breaking flights became legendary. Journalists wrote about a genius crossing continents in record time, but no one noticed how stressed he was. Every detail, from the shape of the wing to the arrangement of the buttons in the cockpit, had to be perfect. And if something went wrong, Hughes could change designs at night, checking engines over and over again, oblivious to fatigue. It was the first real hint that his obsession was beginning to go beyond ordinary perfectionism. He could no longer simply relax or trust others. His colleagues began to notice strange rituals. He demanded that engineers follow his schemes, and even during tests he would track every movement of the pilots. Hughes saw the world in terms of precision and control, and even the slightest deviation from his standards caused internal tension. And inside him, there was a constant anxiety, the fear that something would go wrong, that he would not be able to foresee all the details, that the world would not obey his will. It was a period when his fame was at its height, but the first signs of mental clouding were already visible. Hughes became increasingly withdrawn, rarely slept, living in a world where control and risk were both a passion and a duty. And although he seemed fearless and steadfast, inside him was already awakening a shadow that would later consume his life, a shadow of obsession, fear, and future isolation. Aviation gave him a sense of grandeur, but it was here that the first thread of anxiety was laid, which would eventually turn into a complete addiction to control and phobia. It was the moment when the genius began to transform into a person who would be difficult to understand even to those closest to him. Hollywood welcomed Hughes as a true legend even before he officially stepped on the red carpet. His name was already associated with unprecedented success in business and aviation, and now he brought his energy, exactingness, and genius to the cinema. Hughes bought a studio and quickly became one of the most influential figures in Hollywood. He worked with the most famous actors and directors, was interested in every detail of the production, from the script to the lighting on the set. His charisma was captivating. He could negotiate in such a way that people agreed to projects that had previously seemed impossible. But even amidst this brilliance, the first signs of his obsession began to appear. Hughes controlled every aspect of the process to the point that sometimes directors and actors began to lose patience. If something did not go according to his vision, he could redo scenes several times, changing costumes, sets, camera positions. It was a perfectionism that had not yet become morbid, but was already alarming to those around him. A small hint of the future madness was also manifested in his personal life. Hughes began to avoid contact with the outside world, especially where he could not control the situation. It is known that he began to show the first fears of germs, touching dirty objects, sometimes even food. These still looked like strange habits, but even then those around him felt that behind the brilliance of success there was something deeper, something more incomprehensible. Despite this, his Hollywood era was a bright and productive one. Hughes' studio produced films that became legendary, and his name was associated with success, innovation, and courage. He was a charismatic genius who was both inspiring and intimidating. But even at this point, small signs of anxiety, an intolerance for chaos, and initial phobias were sprouting into his daily life, becoming the first signal of future isolation and obsessive-compulsive behavior. Hollywood gave him light and fame, but it also looked into the dark corners of his mind, where the fears that would one day consume his entire life were born. Here was the first real anxiety that gradually transformed the genius into a man from whom everything but his own obsessive rituals and control would begin to depart. Hughes's peak of power came when the whole world seemed to bow to his name. His empire already encompassed aviation, cinema, business, and even real estate. He was a man who could change the rules of the game in any field. His word carried more weight than the opinion of an entire board of directors, and his decisions could turn failed projects into million-dollar successes. The press called him a genius and a dreamer, but behind the brilliance there was something else, something that began to make itself felt more and more strongly. At this stage, his perfectionism and desire for control became more and more noticeable. He literally lived in a world of his own standards, where every little thing mattered. Engineers in aircraft factories, actors in studios, and even subordinates in financial affairs felt his watchful eye, which checked every step, every document, every detail. If something went wrong, Hughes could spend hours, and sometimes days, correcting what seemed perfect to others. His obsession with order and control was already bordering on obsessive, but at the same time it brought incredible results. Aircraft speed records, studio blockbusters, profitable enterprises. At the same time, Hughes increasingly began to feel an inner anxiety, a fear of chaos and disorder. His fears became more and more specific. He was afraid of germs, unpredictable people, accidents that could ruin his perfect plan. And although to the world this looked like part of his genius, his attention to detail, his extraordinary discipline, in reality, they were small cracks growing in his psyche. This period is a time of brilliance and glory, but at the same time the beginning of internal chaos. Hughes could change the world, but he could not change himself. His empire was huge, but he was already beginning to feel that he controlled everything except his own fear and obsession. And even among the triumph, records, and awards, there was an inner discomfort. A small reminder that genius and loneliness are inextricably linked, and the perfectionism that brought world fame gradually becomes a trap. Even at the peak of his fame and influence, Hughes began to lose control over what had previously seemed under his control. Small fears that had been barely noticeable since childhood now turned into obsessive rituals. He avoided contact with people, was afraid of dirt, germs, and anything that could ruin his perfect order. The first noticeable manifestations of this behavior seemed strange to those around him, but they already signaled serious changes in his psyche. Hughes began to isolate himself, refused joint dinners and meetings, controlled every item in his offices and airplanes. His colleagues and friends at first laughed or tried to ignore his strange whims, but over time they became obvious. He could refuse a meeting if the table was not perfectly cleared, or postpone an important decision until he felt that everything around was clean and safe. Obsessive thoughts and fears began to consume his energy, forcing Hughes to spend nights checking details, remeasuring, and controlling what had previously been perceived as trifles. It was the moment when the genius became not only a charismatic leader and innovator, but also a man struggling with his own demons. His world was no longer just aviation, business, and cinema. It was a world of rules and rituals that he himself created, and without which he felt afraid. Even during flights, he checked every button, every engine, every detail, fearing that any unpredictability could become a disaster. And while it seemed like part of his brilliant approach to life, it was actually the first real sign of mental clouding, a sign that Hughes was gradually drifting away from reality, living in a world of his own fears and obsessions. Small cracks were turning into chasms, and even those closest to him began to feel that the genius they knew was becoming invisible under the shadow of his own obsessions. With each passing year, Hughes became more and more distant from the world he had once controlled with the brilliance of genius. His fears turned into real phobias. Dirt, disease, accidents, and even human contact seemed like potential threats. He began to live in his own homes, planes, and studios as if in a fortress where every surface, every object, every person had to obey his rules. Colleagues and friends who had previously admired his charisma now saw strange rituals that seemed impossible for an ordinary person to perform. Disinfection, checking clothes, repeated inspections of documents and premises. All this became. His empire grew, but Hughes himself gradually disappeared from the real world. Public appearances became rare. Long negotiations turned into short remote contacts, and even his closest aides felt they could not touch his life without risking alarm or anger. He lived in a world of his own rules, where everything was predictable, clean, and safe, and this gave him the illusion of control. Hughes struggled with the fear of chaos every day, and this inner control became his constant companion. Even the smallest deviations, an untidy desk, a different order of documents, foreign smells, caused him panic tension. People began to understand that behind the brilliance of success and fame lies a deep loneliness, and that the genius who was able to conquer the sky and Hollywood becomes a prisoner of his own. It was a period when the world around Hughes remained as bright and expansive as ever, but he lived in the shadow of his own mind. His obsession with control and order now dominated everything: work, relationships, even his own body. And despite the success and millions around him, he began to feel completely alone, because people, even those who loved him, could not cross the line of his fears and imposed. The culmination of chaos came gradually, like a slow, invisible storm that engulfs everything around it. Hughes turned his life into a labyrinth of rules and rituals, where any deviation could become a disaster. He spent his days in locked rooms, airplanes and studios, surrounded by stacks of documents, drawings and notes, which he himself constantly checked, rewrote, and corrected. His days became nothing more than endless checks and controls. The work that had once been a source of inspiration now became a trap. The world around him continued to exist. His empire grew, aviation records were set, films brought in profits, and people praised his brilliant solutions. But Hughes himself could no longer feel this glory. He lived in the darkness of his own mind, where fears and obsessive thoughts became his only companions. The smallest objects, smells, sounds, or disturbances caused internal chaos that could not be tamed. His own obsession became as much a monster as any external threat, and he felt trapped in his own world, where there was no one who could understand or help. His life became a series of rituals and controlled actions: checking engines, blueprints, cubicles, furniture, documents, disinfecting everything around him. Each new idea or project brought success to the world, but for him, only more rules, fear, and loneliness. People felt that there was a dark shadow in his brilliance that could not be blinded by success or money. It was the moment when genius and monster merged into one. Hughes remained the unsurpassed innovator and leader, but he had become a shadow of his former self, isolated, obsessed, and living in a world of his own fears. In his eyes, one could see not the light of glory, but the cold steel of anxiety, steel that would soon meet the ultimate truth about his mind and body. And finally, the moment came when the reality he had been trying to control for so many years caught up with him. Doctors, carefully monitoring his physical and mental condition, informed Hughes of a serious mental disorder and exhaustion of the body. For an ordinary person, this would have been a shock, a challenge that would have turned his life upside down. But Hughes met this news with a strange calm, cold, clear, even almost philosophical. He didn't panic, he didn't scream, he didn't try to deny what he had long felt inside himself. There was something incomprehensible in his gaze. The realization that the control he had tried to exert over the world could never be applied to himself. He felt relieved, as if this diagnosis gave him the right to acknowledge his own limitations, to let go of his fears, and to accept what he could not conquer. At that moment, he felt a mixture of sadness and peace. Sadness for the years he had spent in his own fortress, for all the loneliness that had accompanied him. But the peace was deeper. He felt that now that the truth had been named and recorded, he could finally recognize himself without masks, without illusions of control. It was a cold clarity, a moment of inner harmony that no one could disturb. Hughes realized that his life was both an incredible triumph and a tragedy. He had built empires, changed the rules of the game in aviation, film, and business, but he could never escape his own mind. And it was this realization that gave him the strength to accept himself, his condition, and his fears, not allowing them to completely destroy his spirit. This moment became the culmination of his story, not loud and spectacular, but quiet and cold, like an inner victory over himself that allowed Hughes to face the ultimate truth without hysteria or fear. Hughes left behind an empire that was hard to imagine for one man. Aviation companies, new standards in cinema, innovative technologies, billions of dollars of business. All this remained to the world as evidence of his brilliant energy and courage. But the incredible truth of his life was hidden not in successes and records, but in the shadows that followed him after each achievement. The world knew Hughes as a billionaire, inventor, record-breaking aviator, and film producer, but no one saw the inner battles, fears, and compulsive rituals that accompanied his every day. His greatness was inextricably linked to loneliness and obsession, to the inner struggle between control and the chaos he tried to tame. And that's what made his story so incredible. Successes that seemed perfect were born in a world where chaos and fears were constant companions. For Hughes, his legacy was not just material. It was the idea that a person can conquer any field, reach incredible heights, set records, and create empires, even if their inner world remains complex and painful. His life became proof that genius and tragedy often go hand in hand, that great achievements are inextricably linked to deep inner battles. And here, at the end of his story, the truly incredible truth emerges. Hughes was both a man who conquered the world and a man who could never conquer his own mind. His empire, his achievements, his records, all this remained for people, and he himself left us a lesson that is difficult to forget. Genius always goes hand in hand with loneliness, and great strength often hides great weaknesses. His life was like a flight. The height and speed are incredible, but behind them always follows the cold wind of loneliness, which reminds us that even the strongest are not immune to falling. And in this incredible truth, which few see, lies the whole story of Howard Hughes, a billionaire, inventor, and a man who went crazy, leaving behind a world that will never forget his name.